You know, we've discussed the idea of gaming coming up to a bit of a breaking point for a long time now, at least over the last couple of years, mostly because budgets continue to soar when it comes to these different games, especially ones that are on the higher end in terms of the quote unquote AAA sector. But now we're starting to see some serious cracks in the foundation for these live service games that were thought to basically be untouchable. I'm thinking of games like Fortnite, for example, that did not have a very good week alongside Epic Games, but I do have some serious concerns right now about gaming. And in a way, we're having, some people say, one of the best years in gaming when it comes to releases, but I still look at this and say, gaming has a serious problem. We're going to go over that here today. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. We're going to also start today with this video sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Soylent. With our hectic lives, it can be difficult to get the nutrients we need, but Soylent makes it easy to hit your nutritional goals, even if you don't have the time to prepare healthy, balanced meals. It's the perfect synergy of macro and micronutrients backed by science. I like taking a ready-to-drink meal with me if I'm on the go or if I'm just running low on time that day. There are a bunch of delicious flavors, however my favorite is definitely strawberry, with no refrigeration needed. Soylent is incredibly portable with no prep or cleanup. Soylent's products range in price from $2 to $4 per serving, which is practically a steal based on current food prices, and with sustainable ingredients, it's both good for you and good for the planet. Soylent also gives back, having donated nearly 6 million meals in partnerships with food banks, homeless shelters, hospitals, and dozens of community organizations. Click the link in the description below and use code SpawnWave30 to get 30% off your first subscription. That's code SpawnWave30 for 30% off your first subscription. Thanks again to Soylent for sponsoring today's video. So really, since like the PS4, Xbox One era, when that started up, we have seen budgets be mentioned more and more, and we've seen a lot of these companies be more risk off with the idea of creating new intellectual properties from the ground up. And we've seen a lot of franchises kind of continue along, and really established ones getting the majority of the budget and money dumped into them, which is, yes, playing it safe. But there was an email that was part of that Xbox FTC leak, and I noticed many people, many outlets and stuff were like, hey, you definitely want to check out this email from Phil Spencer. And it's interesting because it is from 2020, which we've been kind of talking more and more about the situation around gaming and budgets getting out of control, and there eventually being a breaking point for the past couple of years, and it appears he was kind of thinking that as well back in 2020. Also, keep in mind, Sean Layden, formerly at PlayStation, has also been discussing this over the last several years now. But in this leaked email from Phil Spencer, what he talks about is like the old days with publishers. Think of like EA, Ubisoft, any of these larger ones worked to bring games to store shelves because there was not a digital distribution method at the time for consoles. That wasn't until like midway to the end sort of the Xbox 360 PS3 generation that we had essentially delivery on demand by pressing a couple of buttons on a digital storefront. However, since then, when we had sort of that moat, as Phil Spencer describes it, kind of set up just by default, because it's very difficult if you're a smaller studio to get your game on store shelves without the help of a Ubisoft or an EA or a Take-Two or any of that, right? In this case, though, because digital distribution has taken over so much, and it's actually pretty easy if you're an indie developer to find the consumer or the customers, the gamers, compared to a couple decades ago, the new moat that these larger companies have created are the AAA games, or the ones that are described to have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of budget. And the idea here being the smaller indie developers would not be able to compete with these larger budget games that have this perceived quality value to them. And you see big time games, big AAA games having even like Hollywood actors involved, and obviously it has a lot of production value being pushed into it, and then the gameplay can be hit or miss, but if it has that nice shiny coat to it when it comes to the graphics or anything, people will look at it and say it's AAA and it's this big high quality blockbuster title, right? The concern that's happening right now is the budgets continue to get out of control as really I would say the budgets continue to move up that would make sense to call it quote unquote AAA. I remember a little while ago, Ubisoft categorized it as being north of $50 million. And we're hearing more and more about budgets being $100 million, like easy, like not even difficult to reach that amount. So the biggest thing right now that these big publishers are finding themselves in is if they want to dump that kind of money into a project, it's got to be a known, proven entity or one that they can basically rent from a company like Star Wars. I mean, that's a good one. Or Sony with Spider-Man. People, of course, look at Sony and think that they like own Spider-Man, but it's really the movie rights technically when it comes to merchandise or video games. That's actually still just owned by Disney. That's one of the reasons that Spider-Man is in Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 on the Switch, because yeah, technically that can happen. And in fact, there were stories that they had gone to Microsoft first, and Microsoft kind of like turned it down or wasn't as interested in Spider-Man, and instead Sony picked it up. And hey, Insomniac's done a great job with it, but that's not Sony's intellectual property when it comes to video games. So yeah, it falls into that category of it being technically a rented one. And it also feels like most companies believe that these games, because they have to compete with other larger games, that they would be open world, they'd be 30 to 50 hours, and it does stack up with some fatigue in mind, especially when you start to notice patterns or the cookie cutter method that we see with Ubisoft games, that one coming to mind. But because there is so much risk involved with new intellectual properties, and there are so many examples of it just not working out, that we're just seeing less creativity in games. Think of Immortals of Avium is I think a pretty good example. The game came out, it wasn't exactly great, but I don't think it was a bad game necessarily. As I played through it, my biggest complaint actually was that the game itself just looked very, very blurry on the Xbox Series X, or just consoles in general. But I thought the game itself was interesting enough, I would say, to make a case for it being a title that you could even recommend to people. However, it did not do well, and less than a month after it came out, well, half the studio just got laid off, and that's just kind of where we are with these games. They're so expensive, if they don't explode out of the gate to resounding success, it could actually sink the entire studio just about. We saw it with Striking Distance and Callisto Protocol, another new intellectual property that came out. They were looking for 5 million sold to make up for the north of $160 to $170 million budget. Sold 2 million copies in 2 or 3 months, and then Glenn Schofield left. So who knows what's going on with that studio? They could be like dissolving in the next year, and you know what? It actually wouldn't surprise me, just because studios pop up and then seemingly go away like constantly. Volition got shut down. And that was actually more because Saints Row, I feel like the image of Saints Row was so damaged that Embracer, who is, of course, looking around to cut out more and more expenses, thought, you know what, Volition, they've had their time. They've been around for decades. But that one Saints Row game that cost them over $100 million, which, look at Saints Row and tell me if that feels like it should have been a $100 million game. It didn't work out. Didn't sell terribly, but didn't work out necessarily. And well, that's it for Volition. One game I do want to keep an eye on just to see how it does in terms of the reception with the player base and also sales charts would be Assassin's Creed Mirage. And the reason I bring that up is because it's somewhat of a break from what Assassin's Creed has been trying to turn into, which are, I will say at times, these very bloated open world experiences where they try to keep you invested for over 100 hours or something. The most recent Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I've had like Jordan and MVG tell me that they spent 80 hours, 100 hours, something like that in it, right? 60 some odd hours just to beat the game, but it just constantly goes on and on and on. Whereas Assassin's Creed Mirage comes in at a more budget-oriented price of $50 and has outlined, said, hey, this is a 20 to 30 hour game and then you're done. Curious that that actually does pretty well for them, because maybe having more of these games that have a reined-in scope maybe a little cheaper, but don't try to balloon the amount of hours you spend in it and then the budget. Sometimes it's good just to have those games that are point A to point B, some fun stuff in the middle, and you're out in 15 to 20 hours. However, the biggest red flag recently with gaming has been the live service purge, is what we can call it at this time, because while a lot of games have been coming out in 2023 and there have been some very good titles, a lot of games have also shut down and just outright been canceled before they came out. So just a quick list of titles that have shut down like this year. So just in 2023, the last 9 months or so. Gundam Evolution, Friday the 13th, Vampire the Masquerade Blood Hunt, Babylon's Fall, Final Fantasy VII First Soldier, Battlefield Mobile, Apex Legends Mobile, Knockout City, Rumbleverse, Crossfire X, Marvel's Avengers technically just shut down this weekend, and one game that didn't even come out, like it was right at the finish line it seems, because they were doing betas for it, was Hyenas. That was recently announced, and in fact it appears that Creative Assembly is going to be going through some quote-unquote restructuring, which actually sounds like just people are being laid off, or they're going to move some pieces around in terms of their workforce. Sega also announced that there were a few other games in development that were being canceled that we didn't even know about, and it wouldn't shock me if those were also live service games or just ideas, maybe in the conceptual stage, but they just said, you know what, we're not dealing with this at all. And it comes back to live service games in general and the category, the sector, becoming incredibly saturated. And a lot of the games now are starting to almost just kind of like flow together to the point where it's hard to tell the difference between them. And I think that's one of the big problems that Hyenas even ran into. I just had felt like I'd seen the game before. I know they did some stuff with like zero gravity, sure, but it's a live service first-person shooter. So in my mind, I already am thinking about what to expect when it comes to battle passes, microtransactions, progression, and it kind of merges together with a lot of the other first-person shooter live service games. And some of that has to do with just how long games take to develop now. The amount of time in development does not match up with really everything that's happening with live services, because it's shifting and changing so frequently in terms of the monetization models, and you tend to build your game specifically around one you've basically gone with at that time. So Battle Pass being a great example, or DLC or microtransactions, XP boosters, cosmetics, being able to change your battle pass on the fly. These are all things that have to be figured out throughout development, a lot of times early on, so you can structure really the consistent reward, that feeling. You have to structure all of that together because you got to keep people invested and involved with your specific game. Live service games, as many as there are, all want you to basically play that game, and that's it. Like, the amount of time they try to demand from you just doesn't work out in the amount of people out there and amount of time to games and the amount of hours, and then the amount of live service games pulling in all directions. The math doesn't work. But this week was particularly interesting and probably raised the biggest red flag to me that sort of says we are getting to that inflection point or that breaking point. And that has to do with a game that and I'm sure many other people thought was untouchable, kind of faltered here, and that's Fortnite. So Epic Games announced that they were laying off 16% of their workforce, and one of the reasons, one of them, we'll go with the other one, it was because they just weren't getting as much money as they were anticipating from Fortnite. Now, apparently their margins shrunk a bit because they were doing things with creators, and it wasn't as lucrative as, I guess, just selling stuff outright, because obviously they do a lot of microtransactions, battle passes, the basics you would expect from these live service games. But they did mention that Fortnite, I mean, the growth is like stagnant. It's starting to grow a little more now from what they had said, but because of this, they've actually been spending more money than they were taking in for, I'm sure, a lot of the promotion stuff that we see with Fortnite collaboration, so on. It hasn't apparently made sense to them to continue on this path because they're also expecting heavy growth as they continue to push towards apparently a metaverse for Fortnite. That's what they said anyway. Maybe bonuses were going to be affected for the higher ups, and they're like, all right, how many people do we have to cut? keep the yacht money. Okay, we'll go with that. 16%, roughly 900 people. But I think it's fair to bring up the question, has Fortnite hit its roof? And if so, what does that mean for all these other live service games that are trying to model themselves after Fortnite? I mean, Fortnite is the game that I'm sure many executives sit up in these boardrooms and go, how do we make this? How do we get our own Fortnite? And I think that's one of the things Sony has been trying to figure out with their own live service games, as they themselves mentioned they had 10 in development. And I think we've seen some of them either already get cut out, like Deviation, where funding was clearly cut because they started laying off a bunch of people too. And GT7, Gran Turismo 7, I think that's counted as a live service game because it's an ongoing title that is always online, and they have microtransactions that, like, it all kind of lines up there, right? So I think we've seen some of them, but then we see Fair Games, Concord, Marathon. Those are all live service titles as well. And I do wonder if Sony's going to fall into that situation where they only have so many people subscribed to their PlayStation Plus tier, which means there are only so many people who have hours in the day to play these titles, and they'll bring in the PC as well because they kind of have to. But surely some of these games are just going to be kind of left out in the cold because people are busy playing their other live service games. And I have to wonder if this is a situation of Sony running a bit behind the trend. And I think that's a situation with these different live service games that are probably still in development. I'm sure there are many publishers who saw Epic Games announce some of their struggles with Fortnite, and they're like, oh, no, we have our own live service game, similar business model, that's been in development for 4 years, about to announce it, and Fortnite's struggling to where they have to lay people off. Oh, okay, this isn't good. And I'm thinking of a title like Suicide Squad. That's one of the better examples of a game that clearly, when they started developing it, made a lot of sense. I mean, Arkham Knight was that 2015, even some support on it. You feel like they maybe started development on Suicide Squad in like 2017 at the latest. At that time, if they could have snapped their finger, brought Suicide Squad to market, I think it actually would have made more sense and people would have been more into it. But because it's been so long and we've seen the trials and tribulations of live services, it showed up looking old. That's the best way I could describe. Like, we all looked at it and said, okay, I've seen that before, I've seen that before, I've seen that before. What else do they got? And they didn't have anything else, and then it was delayed. I don't think anything's going to really change in terms of their business model and their structure of it being this live service looking experience, but clearly they could read the room and went, oh, okay, we were late to the party with this one. And to be honest, I'm really not sure what the solution, I guess, is, because budgets will continue to balloon, expectations will continue to go up along with those ballooning budgets, and we assume bigger and bigger experiences. Like when Grand Theft Auto 6 comes out, I would not be shocked if that game comes in with a budget of like $1 billion or something, and the expectations are sky high then after seeing it, and then the next publisher feels the need to also push the boundary on that, and then how do we work things out with the money actually going in on these games? And does that mean more microtransactions? They got to figure out some new strategy that they don't actually call a battle pass, but it's similar. You see what I'm saying, right? Eventually, yeah, you feel like there's a breaking point. I almost wonder if it means that one of these really big publishers like just goes under. I'm not really sure what the big signal is going to be, but it feels like it's coming soon. So we'll see going forward. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below. I went over a lot in this video, but most of it comes back to game budgets continue to go up. There seem to be some warning signals in the live service sector that I'm sure many big publishers that you know of right now are creating to try to become part of, and they might show up late, which might mean more studios. Actually, probably means more studios are going to go under, and that means, yes, more people in gaming will probably be laid off, and it'll be a whole other situation there. But let me know what you guys think about all this down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.